So yeah, nice to see so many up after the party yesterday. So yeah, I'm Christian. I'm the Android team lead at Realm, and over the last 3 years, we have been building out a remote team that works from pretty much all over the globe. And this talk is going to be about how we made that work and what sort of challenges we are running into. And yeah. But basically, this talk was built from that there's a lot of material out there about how wonderful remote work is, but there isn't a lot about how you actually make it work in practice. So this is some tips on how we actually make that work, so hopefully you can use that. But what this talk isn't going to be about, it's not going to be about for you as an individual, like life hacks, how to make it work. It's more about how you make it work on a team level. So what sort of processes do you need to have, what sort of tools do you need to use and stuff like that, and how you make the social stuff work. It's not going to be like for you as an individual. So yeah. But to give you a little bit of context about this, how many of you have heard of Realm? Okay, a fair amount of you, cool. So yeah, we are a mobile database company. We've been around since 2011. We went public in 2014. We have two main products. One is a mobile database that is a replacement for SQLite on your phones. And then recently we shipped what we call the Realm Mobile Platform, which is a layer on top of that syncs that database between all your devices seamlessly. Right now, we are around 50 employees around the globe, and we have two main offices, one in Copenhagen and one in San Francisco. And roughly 1/4 of our, or 1/3 of our employees, they're working remotely away from those offices. So we're not a fully distributed company, but we're getting there. So yeah, this is where we're coming from, basically. And basically what we found is that every team is different when it comes to being distributed and being remote, because there are so many differences in time zones. So are everyone working in the same time zone, or are they working across time zones? What kind of languages do they speak, and stuff like, and then culture and stuff like that. So this is something you really have to keep in mind when you're building these teams, because it does have a massive impact on how you actually approach it. To exemplify with us, for example, so how we are organized is that we have teams per language, basically. So we have a team working on the core product, and then we have language teams on top. So we have a C++ team, and then we have like an Android team and an iOS team and a JavaScript team and so on. And if we take, for example, the core team, historically they have been focused around Copenhagen. Then last year we had one joining from Canada. He was there for a year, and then he decided to go back home. And he was, yeah, sure, you can do that. So now he's working from Canada, and the rest are still in Copenhagen. So they have this really focused around one place and then one outlier. Then we have our Objective-C and Swift team. They're mostly focused around San Francisco, with a few outliers in Australia and in Japan. So they're getting they still have this focus around at one place, but are getting a bit more stretched out. And then we have the Android team, which I'm on. Historically, we've been the most distributed in the company, always. None of us are sitting in one of the main offices. All of us are sitting remote. And basically, we are spanning 17 time zones. And this really shows you how many different ways of being remote there actually is, and there are more than this, right? But what we found really is that you really have to embrace that difference. You have to allow to experiment with the processes around how each team works, because what works for one team might not work for another team. And just having one team member change can drastically change how the team actually functions. For example, the Android team, when we started actually out just in Denmark. Then we added some people in Asia, and just that shift was enough to make changes, right? Fortunately for us, the guys in Asia they were happy working late, so they're working in their evening, which means we actually have an overlap, which is really great. But then we had one guy joining from San Francisco, and that's 9 hours in the opposite direction. I don't know if any of you have tried to work remotely with people in San Francisco. That 9-hour difference is really painful, because no one is actually working at the same time. So when that happened, we actually had to look at on how we actually approached work, because it just massively changed things. And this also means that whatever I'm saying up here, you can't just take that uncritically and just use it, because you really have to look at your own context. But hopefully it can be some advice you can look at. But I think the biggest difference, or the biggest pain point we're actually seeing, is that if you have teams that are only partially remote versus like teams that are fully remote, it is actually that fully remote teams actually have an easier time functioning, because everyone is feeling the pain, right? For example, if you have our core team, which are normally focused around an office where they can all sit, then they're not really used to having this mentality of, okay, there's one guy not here, we have to include him, right? So he sort of get the feeling that he's being left out, while, for example, the Android team, where everyone is remote, everyone is feeling the pain if things aren't being communicated. So this is really something you have to keep in mind. The next thing is really about communication, and this really seems obvious, right? If you're in a remote team, then you have to make your communication asynchronous, because you're not sitting, you can't speak to each other in real time. And this is really, it sounds obvious, but it's actually a lot harder than it sounds, because it really shifts how you think about it from being like interrupt based. So like, I guess most of you try to sitting in an office, right? So if you have a problem, you get up, then you go to your colleague, tap him on the shoulder and ask him a question, and then you get a response back. And this purely doesn't work in a remote-based team, because people might not be working at the same time and they might not be online, right? So this means you're shifting your mentality from interrupt-based to being like this push-pull model, where basically you're pushing stuff up into the cloud and hoping some other will react to it. And this really impacts how you think about things. So yeah, and how it actually impacted us is, for example, so our process is sort of Scrum-like, or some mix between Scrum and Kanban. So we're trying to do these stand-ups. I don't know how many of you are working with an agile process, so you know stand-ups. Yeah, most of you, right? So you know that, okay, stand-ups, often it happens that you're standing around for 20 minutes, and in 15 of those minutes, you're not really caring about what's being said, because it's just a waste of time. So, but we're still trying to have this like stand-up model, but we're just doing it online instead. And this is actually extremely efficient, because I literally just spend 2 minutes every day just writing up, okay, what did I do yesterday? What am I doing today? Are there any blockers? And if there's nothing to react on from the other, then I don't have to care about it, right? But if there is something we can discuss, then we just do it right there. And this also gives you insight into what everyone else is doing, but you don't have to feel like you're wasting time doing it. And the same approach goes to, so we are trying to be really transparent on what we do. So that means that we are taking these stand-ups, the stand-up status, and aggregating into a weekly status, so that every team is sort of on a weekly basis saying, okay, this is what we accomplished this week, this is what we're going to do next week. And this actually gives a pretty good insight into the rest of our organization. So for example, I know what the core team is doing or the iOS team is doing, and it actually is really helpful, for example, for our sales teams or our marketing teams, because then they get an insight into what the engineering is doing without actually having to ask for it. So everything is really visible. And this is really, really helpful. So when it comes to asynchronous code reviews is sort of a tricky thing, right? Because a lot of times code reviews is this back and forth where you're saying, okay, you have some issues here, you need to fix those, and then you are fixing those, and then you're getting reviewed back. And that sort of back and forth is really problematic once you have a distributed team, because if this is going on for a long while, then, for example, if I'm waiting for a review from one in San Francisco, there's basically 24 hours between each cycle, which is extremely painful. So you really have to try to avoid that in a distributed team. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, okay, we need to make code reviews as efficient as possible. That means that, okay, your pull request has to be really small, because that means that other people have an easier time reviewing it. So there's actionable items each time that you can just do, and then you're done. And we're trying to make this optimistic approvals, we call them, where basically we're trusting that the other guy is reacting to what we're saying, right? So if I'm reviewing some code, I'm saying, okay, you have to fix these 5 items. But once they're fixed, I don't need to see it again. I'm just going to assume it's okay, and then you can merge it, right? Because then you're sort of short-circuiting that, so that we're just going to assume that people know how to fix it, and then it's fixed. I guess one advantage is that, so we are building like an API for developers, for mobile developers, and nothing is getting shipped in real time, right? So I mean, when we're merging stuff to our master branch, it is going to out in a snapshot release on Maven, but it's not something that is being deployed to like end users immediately. So that means, of course, if things do slip through review for this, then we can still go back and fix it, right? And that's, I guess, that applies to everyone that's working with mobile, just because shipping things to Google Play Store or it's just there's just a turnaround time there, right? So you can catch mistakes. And the tricky part about code reviews is also that developers really don't like reviewing code, right? So or they will rather write their own code than reviewing other people's code, and that is actually problematic once you have a distributed team, because if people are not doing it, then you are actually delaying the other team member for maybe another day, which can be painful as well. So what we're trying to do is saying, okay, so it's okay that you don't feel like reviewing code during the day because you're getting interrupted, but at least when you're getting in the morning, you're not doing anything right. So that at that point, you should really try. At that point, you can go in and see, okay, what's up for review, and then do that, and then you can continue with the rest of the day, because that means that we are definitely sure that code gets reviewed at least once a day, so that you are unblocking the other person. So when he gets back in, he can actually start reacting to that code. And this brings us to how tools and processes work, because it's really easy. So as a remote team, you're really dependent on the tools you use, because I mean that's what we use to interact with other people all day long, right? So what we really have to be careful about is that your tools don't dictate your process, because it's really easy to get into the mindset that, oh, I'm using GitHub, and GitHub only allows me to do that, so I can only do this. But instead, you really have to look into that, okay, what kind of process do we actually want? And then pick your tools based on that, instead of just saying, oh, everyone is using Slack, or everyone is using GitHub, so we should do that. Look at what you really need, and then pick the tools based on that. And this is something we've really been aware of. So what we're really trying to do is try to determine why are we picking a tool we're using, right? And this basically starts with who are the primary user of that tool. Is it your other team members? Is it your team leads? Is it your product managers, your VPs, your CEOs? Because these people have wildly different requirements from your tools. For example, yeah, I'll get into some examples later. But what we're really trying to do is saying, okay, we're really trying to make it easy for developers. So we're trying to pick our tools so the developers have an easier time. And then we just going to have to accept that, for example, our product managers, they have a slightly harder time figuring things out. But this is something you really have to keep in mind. So this is the tools that we use at Realm. So some of them are pretty standard, right? So we're using Slack for chat. We're using GitHub for our code repository. We're an open source project mostly, so that means that makes sense for us. You can use anything you want. Where it gets a little more tricky is, for example, regarding video chat. So we started out with Hangouts because it seemed to work fine in the beginning, but then the quality sort of drops, and once you get enough people in, Hangouts sort of doesn't function anymore. So we actually transitioned to something called Zoom. It's a paid product. It works great for us, but I mean, there's tons of services out there. Where things get slightly more like something you're not used to when you're working like in an office is for example, for when we're doing like prototyping or like design discussions, then we're actually using Google Docs for this, because it's really hard to get people into an office and doing like a brainstorm session. So what we're trying to find some tools that allows us to do that online instead. So this is actually one of the tricky points where we haven't like found the golden solution yet. So Google Docs is probably the closest one, because this allows us to like collaborate in real time and comment on what other people are writing, and everyone can edit in the same document. And then where we've actually been iterating the most is actually around how we prioritize and organize our like issues, because historically GitHub has actually been really bad at it. So GitHub is great if you have like a small project with a single repo where you can just look at your issues, then it's fine, sort of fine. But as soon as you start to get multi-repo dependencies, then GitHub sort of breaks down. So we have been trying a few tools here. First, we started out with something called Waffle, which is an add-on on GitHub, which basically gives you Kanban-born lanes, so you can just sort of see what things are. And that sort of it just failed pretty badly once you started getting dependencies between repos as well. So then we actually tried Jira. I guess how many of you know Jira? Yeah, a lot of you, right? So this is this massive tool where it can basically do everything in a kitchen sink, but it takes a massive amount of setup, and it's not really great for developers because they have to keep, at least for us, because we did most of our stuff in GitHub for the public part, and then we had to go to Jira to fix things there. So we ended up trying Jira and abandoned it again because it just didn't. I mean, our product managers really liked it because they could really get a good overview of milestones and deadlines and stuff, but the developers really hated it, right? So that's why we actually ended up abandoning Jira again. And right now we're using something called SignHub. This is something like Waffle, which is an add-on to GitHub, which just integrate directly into the GitHub web page. So that means that developers can just go to GitHub, and then they see everything there. So we have releases there, we have epics, we can do all of those things there in SignHub, which just integrate into the UI we're using daily. And this works really well for us. But I mean, it really depends on the company what will function there. But this is definitely an area where we can see that you really need to iterate on finding the correct tool. But there's a tons of options out there. But that said, the single biggest decision you probably made is what kind of chat tool you're using, because this is it's going to be your primary work tool as a remote member. So we're using Slack. I mean, there's a ton of options. But I'm going to talk a bit about how we're using Slack most efficiently. So we are really trying to use Slack as fine-grained as possible, which means right now we have close to 200 channels. And we are basically saying that, okay, only general is a required channel, everything else is optional. But we're also saying, okay, anyone can create a channel if they want, because we want to have this, the same feeling as if you have it in an office, right? You can just start to talk about anything, which should be the same in Slack. So if you want to discuss something, you should be able to create a channel for that and then have a discussion in there. But we're also trying to have really fine-grained channels. So we don't have these big channels where a ton of stuff is happening. So that means that we really try to have them as fine-grained as possible. This, for example, means that each team has a channel where they can discuss their team-related things. Then we have feature channels as well. So that means that many of our features are cross-spanning multiple teams, right? So that means that we can pull in multiple team members into that channel, and they can just talk about some specific API we want to make. We also have these really temporary channels. So for example, if there's a complicated bug report that requires input from multiple people, we just create a channel for that single bug report. And then once it's solved, we close it again. So that means we can have channels that just are open for a day or two, and then you're closing it again. But this means that you're not going to interrupt a lot of people with things they don't care about, because if they're not joining the channel, they're not going to get notified. Of course, we also have social channels. So Game of Thrones was popular. Except that channel is actually quite dangerous in a remote team, because the guys in the US are seeing the episodes before you do. So you don't want to join it until you've seen the episode. But one thing we definitely found is that in a remote team where people are living across time zones, threads in Slack are really, really useful. Because for those of you who have used Slack, you've probably seen this fire hose of stuff going on, where people are commenting in between each other and you have multiple discussions going on. And if you try to do that, for example, if I'm leaving work in Denmark and then coming up the next morning and seeing what happened in the US, if I have to browse a channel with 200 messages and 10 discussions interleaved, then it's just impossible for me to get an idea what's going on, right? So we really try to force people into using threads, because that means that it's really easy to browse a channel and see, okay, this is what I need to care about, and the rest I can just skip. So I would really, really advocate using threads if you're working distributed. But that said, Slack definitely isn't perfect. So Slack is really, really prone to information overload. So you really have to be careful. This is also one of the reasons we do try to do fine-grained channels, right? So you only need to join the channels you care about. Otherwise, I mean, there's just so massive amounts of information in a distributed company in Slack. So yeah. Also, Slack is actually really bad at storing persistent information because things just are written and then they scroll out of view, right? Just like Twitter, things get written and then they're out of visibility. And one of the reasons is that search in Slack is kind of bad. So what we're trying to do is so if there's anything, like saying we're having a discussion in Slack about something and we can come to an agreement somewhere, we are trying to pull that information out of Slack and putting it into a wiki or GitHub issue or whatever, just so that things are not in Slack. So Slack shouldn't be like your primary, like your final source for any conclusion. So this is just for like discussions, but as soon as you have a conclusion, you're moving that conclusion out of Slack into something more persistent. At least we found that that's working most efficiently for us. Also, notifications in Slack is really, really bad. At least if you just use Slack without modifying it, then you are going to be interrupted all the time. So how many of you are using Slack or have tried it? Okay, a lot of you. So you know that, okay, if you're using the desktop client, then you're basically getting interrupted for every single message in the channel, right? And it's just extremely annoying. So what we're trying to do is saying, okay, so they have these mentions where you can sort of trigger notifications for people. So one of the big ones is channel, which basically notifies everyone in the channel. And we're basically saying you should never use this one. And the reason is that for us, because we have so many channels, people are normally lurking in a lot of them, right? For example, the Java channel. I think we are 5 on the team, but there's like 40 people in there, right? So that means that if we're using @channel, we're basically going to notify everyone else about something they really don't care about, most likely. So we really try not to use that one. Also here, which notifies everyone online, doesn't make sense in a distributed company because, well, people are not necessarily online, right? So you're probably not triggering the ones you care about. I think the only place where it really makes sense, so our San Francisco office, for example, they use it for saying, okay, now lunch is here, where it makes perfect sense, right? Because the people online there care about lunch, right? But everyone else doesn't care. But what we found is that, so recently Slack created these group mentions where you can sort of say, put people into like a specific group, and then you can just notify those people. And this is actually really efficient because that means, for example, I can just notify my Java group. So in the Java channel, I'm just using this one, and then only the 5 people on my team will actually get notified if there's something they care about. And the rest, they can just browse the channel without getting notified. So I would really recommend using these groups because that really makes it makes it possible to target the specific people you want to trigger notifications for. So when it comes to notification setup, so this is how it looks in Slack. So the default setting is basically that on mobile, you will just get mentions where you're mentioned, which is fine. But on desktop, you will get notified about any channel or any new message in any channel you're in. And that is just a no-go in my mind. So I would definitely recommend setting it just to being mentioned specifically, either through a group or like specifically. Or you can make it even more. You can mute entire channels if you're just lurking, right? So definitely look into this if you're using Slack a lot. Also, you can actually one of the problems with working in a distributed team is that you risk being at work all the time. Especially for me, when I have a lot of communication with San Francisco, for example, and they're starting to get up when I'm starting to leave work, right? So it's really easy for me to get into a mode, I'm just hanging on a little longer so I can catch up and do discussions. And in order to avoid that, I'm basically saying, okay, I don't want any notifications anywhere between 6 and 8 in the morning. So that means, of course, I can still check Slack if I have time I want or whatever, but I'm not going to be prompted about it. So it's my decision if I'm going to do it or not. And this is actually a really helpful way of trying to actually have some life outside work. But one of the things that are really tricky in remote teams is how decisions are being made. Because if you don't have have an office where you can just say, we have to have this discussion now, let's take a meeting and figure it out, that just doesn't work in a distributed team, at least across time zones, because people are not at work at the same time. So no matter what you do, finding a time for a meeting is going to hurt someone, right? So for us, we're basically saying we have one required meeting per week per team, where we'd like to sort of catch up on the week or have any discussions there. And finding that time is it's just going to be painful. So what we're doing is, so our team meeting is 3 p.m. European time, which is, I mean, that's great for me because it's in the middle of my workday, but it sucks for Asia because it's basically 10 o'clock there. It sucks for America because it's basically 6 o'clock. So I mean, so it sucks for a lot of people, right? So we really try to make our meetings as efficient as possible. Also, so I'm an Android lead, so we have a meeting between the other leads, so we can sort of discuss processes and stuff like that. And that's 8 p.m. my time, which sucks for me, right? It's great for America because it's in the middle of the workday, and then Asia is pretty much asleep, but we don't have any leads there, so that's fine for them. But this really shows that if you're working in a distributed environment, you're probably going to have to be flexible about it, because I mean, you could try to get along without meetings at all. I'm not sure how that will work in practice. I mean, we haven't tried that yet, because there are just some things that are easy to discuss up front and just saying, okay, now we're going to get together and get it out of the way. But you're just going to have to be flexible about it. So from my perspective, I have like one day per week where I'm saying, okay, I'm just going to have meetings this day, and that's it, right? So, but yeah, it is just as harder to get consensus in a distributed environment, because it's sometimes hard to know who's making the final call, and discussion can go back and forth over multiple days and stuff like that. So this is actually something we have struggled with quite a bit, because especially when there are concerns that are across teams, because then there's like no one immediately responsible for making the decision, right? So if the Android team have an opinion and the iOS team have an opinion, then there's no one to say, okay, this is what we're going to do. So what we are trying to do now is that we are trying to have something called feature leads, which is basically a way around this. So whenever we have a big new feature, we're basically assigning one person and saying, okay, now you're in charge of making this feature happen. So that means that, of course, you should try to come into agreement about the API or the functionality or whatever. But if you can't come to an agreement, it's your responsibility to make a decision in the end. So we unblock these sort of discussions. And this is something you really have to think about, because otherwise we literally had a feature being in discussion for close to 2 years, which is completely insane, right? Just because no one was able to make a decision. And this leads us to transparency, because in a remote team things really, unless you're really explicit about it, things have a tendency to get hidden. So what we're trying to do is saying you really have to be as transparent as possible about what you do. This is also one of the reasons we do daily stand-ups, right? It's so that we sort of quickly catch if things are blocking people, or you can say, okay, now you 3 days in a row wrote that you were going to do this, but you did something else in the next day. So what happened since you changed your focus and stuff like that? So yeah. So that really means that you have to communicate. There's no way around that. So if you're the sort of person that sort of just enjoys staying in your corner, then being on a remote team is probably not for you, because it's just going to be painful for all of us. So what you're going to do is you're going to have to surface block us really quickly. That means that even though you're just blocked for a day, you're going to say, okay, this feature, this whatever is blocking me, so I'm doing this today instead, or something else, because then we can react to that quickly. Also, you have to be really explicit about what you need, because in a remote environment, for example, there's so much stuff happening in Slack and email from GitHub, because there's just notifications everywhere, right? So unless you are really explicit about what you need from other people, they might miss it. So if you need a code review from someone, mention them explicitly or stuff like that. So this actually also helps you getting interrupted, because if you're really explicit about what you need and what your progress is, you're actually getting interrupted less, because then people know how far you are and what your exact status is. So they're not going to interrupt you to ask you how you're doing because they know already, right? So it's actually also beneficial for you to do this. Especially when it comes to pull requests, this kind of visibility have a big impact. So I know a few people that they have this tendency to say, okay, when I'm making a pull request, it is perfect. I need to polish it before I make a pull request. So I'm making the history nice, I'm doing everything so it's just perfect. And that just is a really poor fit for a remote team, because there you probably want to have discussions while it's ongoing, or you might want to cut things while it's happening, right? So what we really try to promote is that you should, once you start a feature, you should, as soon as possible, actually just make a pull request and just mark it work in progress. Because that means that anyone else from the company can actually look in and see, oh, you missed this or already, right? And it's actually easier to ask for help. So what you normally do in an office is you're just working on your feature locally, and then if you have a problem, you just pull in a colleague and look at your screen to figure out what's happening, right? But that, of course, that doesn't work in a remote team, or well, you can screen share, but that is just easier to have it visible. So by having it, so just pushing as soon as possible is also about this transparency, right? There isn't any shame in showing that you actually have something. It's okay to have fix me's in your code, or saying, okay, I'm going to coming back to this and stuff like that. And it actually, especially for us as an open source project, we're actually also promoting feedback from the community, because people can see, now you're discussing this feature I care about. Maybe I actually have some input to my use cases, right? So we can actually get input from the outside before we go too far into the wrong direction. And especially, so GitHub. So 3 years ago, GitHub was actually kind of bad at this sort of like big collaboration stuff, but they really, really increased the usability over the last couple of years. So for example, they have this squash and merge button now, so that basically you shouldn't be afraid of having like a messy history on GitHub, because once you merge your PR, you can just squash the entire history into one single nice commit. So don't be afraid to make like work in progress commits or backup commits or whatever they're called, because you just squash in the end and then have a nice history once it actually reaches your master branch. So one of the biggest pain points around working remotely is probably the turnaround time. So there's no way around that you're just going to have to wait longer for feedback, because the ones you're requesting feedback from might live in another time zone. So that means that you are going to have to wait for the next day. And it might not mean that your work is going to take longer, like if you compress the work into, it might not take longer, but in calendar time, it will take longer. And this really frustrates a lot of people. And this is a mentality you really have to get around. So what we try to do to minimize this is we're trying to advocate multitasking to a degree, right? So saying like, okay, you maybe have one big feature you're working on. So do that, and once that's ready for review, we have this little backlog of like smaller stuff. You need some support answered, there's a small bug fix, stuff like that. So you can work on that while you're waiting on feedback. But it really requires, this remote mentality really requires you to be able to multitask things, because there are times where you will be waiting for other people, right? So this is actually also a perfect time once you're actually doing that. Now it's actually a good time where you can go and review other people's code. So now we come to the sort of people part of this, so I guess most of you, if you've been online and seeing Twitter or Facebook or whatever, any sort of online community, it's really easy where people get the wrong impression of what other people are saying, right? Because text is just so bad at conveying intent and information. So it's really easy to misunderstand what people are saying, especially for us, especially if people are not native English speakers. I mean, most of us at Realm we're not native English speakers. So I mean, we might read or speak English like somewhat fluently, but we're not native, right? So that means that there's a lot of smaller things that are going to be missed. So this is something that you really have to keep in mind, is that really try to think that people are doing the best they can, and work from that approach. For those of you that know that work with Agile, they have this concept of retrospectives, where they go back and see what happened over the last sprint. And this is one, what is called the retrospective prime directive, which is the mentality you go into when you do that. And this basically says that everyone did the best job they could, given what they knew at the time, the skills and abilities, the resources available, and the situation at hand. And if you have this mentality to your colleagues in a remote team, this actually massively improves the situation. Because this means that instead of blaming people for saying, oh, you didn't do the right thing, why didn't you, you're an idiot, right? Then you're instead going to question, okay, I'm going to assume you did the best you could. So if something went wrong, it wasn't you personally that was an idiot. It was because our process was wrong or our tools was wrong, right? So instead, we're going to look at, okay, if we have a problem, we're going to focus on fixing that instead of just blaming people. So this is a really, really key mentality to have. Also, you really have to remember this social interaction because this really easily gets missed once you're just sitting from home and only interaction, and you're only interacting through Slack or chat, right? So what we do is we, for example, for our weekly meetings, it's okay for us to start the first 5 minutes with just chatting about, oh, how your kid's doing, how was your vacation, so what did you do, stuff like that, right? So just spend the first 5 minutes just having this human connection, so it's easier to get apart again. And also, of course, video is pretty much mandatory. I mean, it's so easy to get up and running, right? And then you can actually see people's faces. But other things we do, for example, is also we're trying to remember people's special events. So if you have any birthday, so at least in Denmark, it's normally you celebrate that with cake in the office. But how we do it instead is that then we're trying to find your local bakery where you live and then have them send you a cake. So you just get one at home, right? So it's just small stuff like that really impacts that people feel part of the team. And of course, we have a bunch of social channels on Slack as well, so you can chat about dogs or Game of Thrones or food or whatever you wanted to chat about, right? But most importantly, is actually also remembering to meet face to face, because just having met people once just makes it so much easier to go apart and just have this sense of knowing where people are, so you know how their humor is and how they normally talk about things, right? So what I like to say is that it's just harder to think of people as idiots once you met them face to face, and this really is true. So what we're trying to do is that we are trying to have a company-wide get-together every year. So the last couple of years it's been in Copenhagen, so where everyone gets together and we can just meet and hang out and talk about vision and big picture stuff and trying to just connect on a human level so it's easier to get apart again. And at the same time, we are each team is then also trying to have their separate get together every year. So they meet and can talk about, so we can talk about Android stuff, or what should we do about Kotlin and stuff. So something that really doesn't affect a lot of other people, but just for us as a team. And this really helped team building. So this picture down here, so we started this small tradition of that everyone should bring candy from their home country for these events. And just let me show you, whatever they eat in Japan, it's really, really awful. So, but yeah, I guess the same thing about licorice and Danish licorice. So yeah, but it's a fun of things like this, right? So, but yeah, we're getting close to the end. So what we learned so far is that if you're working in a distributed environment, it really has a massive impact on transparency throughout the organization, which is really, really helpful. Also when you're onboarding, because everything you do is basically written down or it's persisted in some way, which means it's easier to onboard people because there's not a lot of implicit knowledge around the organizations. Things are written down. If you're working remotely, you're basically going to have to trust people, and you're going to trust that they're using this flexibility for the best of the organization, right? And this actually makes for really happy employees. I think for us, for the Android team, over the last 3 years, we only have 1 people actually quitting the team. The rest are actually still there. So yeah. Also, it actually has a huge impact on diversity. So it might not be so. People are talking a lot about having more females in programming, so it's not about that as such. It's more about you actually getting people with different languages and different cultures on the team, which is, I mean, it just gives another perspective to things, which is really, really helpful. And of course, it increases hiring as well, right? So we can hire from all around the world, which definitely is easier than just trying to hire from Copenhagen, for example. But so of course, everything isn't perfect, right? So what we also seen is that if you have a process problem in your team, this is just going to be massively magnified if you're being remote, because it's harder to fix. So this is also why we're really trying to have reviews of our process regularly. So we try to figure out, okay, how can we optimize things? Because if you have a problem, it's going to impact your team in a quite big way. Also, the big one is that there's just going to be a longer turnaround time, and especially in crunch periods, that can sort of be painful. So really try to find ways around this, like doing optimistic reviews or try to short circuit how decisions are being made and stuff like that. And the biggest one is probably overlapping work hours. If you're going to have a distributed team, I highly recommend that you have some overlap, because if you don't, it just increases the complexity of trying to get information around a lot. So at least just a couple of hours is enough, but definitely try to have some overlap somewhere. So yeah. But yeah, that's it. Those 9 tips I made here. So yeah, any questions?